Required minimum fuel. So fuel was a definite limitation. They wanted me to make a few passes for the crowd once they got the notice. So they had a tanker. Once it got subsonic, we had a tanker that gave us just a little more fuel so we could make a few passes for the crowd there at Dulles. So it was really exciting, and we're just really happy to be here today. Buzz, is that all you need? Okay. Required minimum fuel. So fuel was a definite limitation. They wanted me to make a few passes for the crowd once they got the notice. So they had a tanker. Once it got subsonic, we had a tanker that gave us just a little more fuel so we could make a few passes for the crowd there at Dulles. So it was really exciting, and we're just really happy to be here today. Buzz, is that all you need? Okay.
Air Force, but then he also did it for NASA. Because NASA was actually the last agency or group to fly any SR-71, and that was in 1999. We now have Pat Bledsoe. He was one of my instructors that checked me out in the program. He was the chief of staff of that. He also is the world record holder for the 1,000-kilometer closed course that we set in for the bicentennial of Pat and the crews that set the speed records to celebrate the bicentennial of the United States. So the SR is still the top manned air-breathing airplane in the world, 2,193 miles an hour. We then have Barry McKean, SR-71 RSO. That's the navigation, the critical navigation function, and Carol Stayer in the critical function. You know, if you can't communicate, you don't get much done. Ed Yielding, you've also met Ed. He was a member. He was a test pilot. And towards the end of his career, he he's probably the longest one up here that was in the program at that time. I may be wrong in that. And there's somebody I want to acknowledge out here, and I don't know where he is. There is a retired Colonel Don Walbrecht. And he is from the very early start of the SR-71 program. And we're the Virginia Aviation Hall of Fame. I was an instructor pilot there. We're not going to just give you a little background. I came to the program in 1975. I was there till 1981. I'd come for about, we need a new airplane. It doesn't fly at 450 miles an hour. It flies at 2,150 miles an hour. It doesn't fly at 70,000 feet. It flies at 85,000 feet. And President Eisenhower's #1 requirement, I want an airplane crew chief FT&C. So this is America's first stealthy airplane. It's a family of four. The SR could carry a heavier payload, that the mission was so complex you should have really 2 crew members, the criticality of having that reconnaissance systems officer. There were 2 of the airplanes modified to launch a Mach 3 drone, and that really was not successful. There were 3 airplanes built to test to see a Mach 3 fighter interceptor. It's a big airplane. You can see from there, empty airplane is 60,000 pounds. A fully fueled airplane at takeoff is 140,000 pounds. That's 80,000 pounds of fuel. Our side window as a pilot was about 560. The airplane grew 3 to 4 inches in length, 1 inch or 2 in width. So the airplane is 93% titanium. And I think what you'll find interesting, all that titanium came from Russia. They never knew who they sold it to. This is the stealthiness. This is all the special treatment on all the edges that basically captures the radar energy and does not allow it to be reflected. It is not stealthy by today's standards, but it was stealthy in its day because they hadn't adjusted to this low a radar signature. This is the beast. 6,000 pounds. Pratt Whitney operated. The core was 2,000 degrees. The afterburner was 3,200 to 3,400 degrees. It's the only engine inlet afterburner airplane in the world that the faster you went, the less fuel you burned. Every 2 hours, you air refueled. It came down from where 85,000 feet down to 25,000 feet. And in 12 to 15 minutes, you took on 70,000 pounds of fuel, sometimes 80, depends where you were, and said goodbye to the tanker and went on your way. The cameras. If all of you went out in the parking lot, well, it's an overcast day, but if it was a clear day, 5,000 feet, 2,150 miles an hour, take your picture and you'd see all of you. You cannot see your faces, but this is the quality of the photography that was being created back in the 70s and 80s. We could also have you see a lot of what was on the ground to make your intelligence assessments. Very quickly, why was it retired? The Cold War came to an end. We thought you wouldn't need an airplane like this. It was costing $85,000 an hour to operate because tankers, everything else. Satellites are not cheap. So, this is the cost is probably not the driver. The real driver is that every one of you in this audience has a smartphone. We had to land the airplane to take the data, process it, and get it to the people who required it. Today, the metric to our president is 10 minutes. It all comes through digital data links. Now I'm going to turn it over to Michael, and he's going to start down the line.
Let's see if this, okay, it sounds like it's going to work. My name is Mike Relja. I'm a retired senior master sergeant. I got in the program at Beale in 1973. Started out as a crew chief on the B model, which was the only trainer Beale had. It actually had dual controls, so the IP in the back could instruct the pilot up front, the student, on flying with the airplane. I stayed at Beale till 1976. I then went to Kadena. Det 1 was one of our detachments over in Okinawa, Japan. I spent 4 years there on the program. We had 3 airplanes at any given time at Kadena. From Kadena, I went back to Beale in 1980, back on the flight line again. By that time, I was a master sergeant and a line chief, supervisor, that type of person rather than being an individual crew chief. Around 1981, I got transferred down to Palmdale. Palmdale had the flight test facility and the depot. We would get about 3 or 4 airplanes a year to do a complete depot mod on them, update service bulletins, do depot level inspections. Plus we had the flight test airplane down there that we used to test any new equipment that was going to be put on the aircraft in the field. I retired from there in 1988. Don Emmons was my boss at the time, hired me back civil service. Back at Palmdale doing the same thing as a civilian now. 1990 program gets canceled, I get picked up by NASA. NASA got 3 airplanes, I got your trainer. This particular airplane was a NASA airplane for a while, and they had the last airplane built 980, which they kept and they still have. I served the NASA SR program until the last flight in '99. One of my last accomplishments was the destruction of all the spare parts in 2007. It's actually on YouTube if you want to really be depressed, where your tax dollars go when they finish with the program. I retired from NASA in 2009, and I spent 10 years as a contractor for NASA on SOFIA, which was an airborne telescope in the back of a 747, which is now defunct and in the Pima Museum. So if you want to see that airplane, head down to Tucson. Thank you very much.
Hi, I graduated from Force pilot training, got my wings and my commission as a second lieutenant in March of 1961 at Webb Air Force Base, Texas. Then I went to Moody Air Force Base, Georgia, for a couple of years to be an instructor, first in the T-33, then the T-37.
SR-71 is on the ground. So you see the politics drive a lot, or can drive a lot. Now, when I flew in the Middle East for President Carter, he finally got the clue when he was getting handed his proverbial butt. We started overflying more places, but unlike the crisis of being able to fly through France, when I flew deep into the Arabian Peninsula, I had to go around Spain and France because neither government would allow us to overfly, but at least the Spanish would allow us to have our tankers there. So of 2 of my 5 refuelings, the tankers actually came out of, and hopefully we can keep it interesting and answer your things that you've always wanted to know something about. Young man. No, not in this group. But that brings a good point. My wife felt most comfortable with this airplane. We may have lost 12 airplanes, but we never had an Air Force fatality. All of us rode on an absolutely magnificent rocket ejection seat. So if you got to the point where it wasn't going to work, I don't want to trip on my own wire, you could pull the handle and go. Refueling. Is anybody?
Our flight across the nation was probably the longest between refueling. So we came off the tanker over the Pacific, flew 200 miles to the coastline, 2,400 miles to the east coast, so that's 2,600 miles. And we turned around and typically takes about 200 miles to descend to the next tanker. So that would be right at 3,000 miles between refuelings.
With the refuels done at?
We would normally connect with the boom at about 315 knots. And when we did that, the tanker pilot would normally ease his throttles up to max continuous thrust so that he could accelerate as he offloaded fuel and we took on the fuel. So by the time we got finished with our refueling, we'd be doing 350 or 360 knots. So we would be going as slow as we could go, and the tanker by then would be going as fast as he could go. Except when it was hot, because the fuel tanks, which are not actually separate tanks, they're just part of the structure, had a high temperature silicone sealant in them that was designed to withstand high temperatures, which it did, but it got hard and got cracks in it when it cooled off, so that's why the airplane leaked.
Later on, while I was still there, we started using the KC-10. And those guys could go at 350 knots, so our rendezvous with them was 350, and we stayed there. I never had any kind of problems with it. So it's a little bit different than the 135.
Okay.
So, piggybacking off of the fuel question and the leaking, when maintenance had to be performed on the aircraft, how do you determine how loose was everything fitted together? How was that?
The question, how loose the airplane was fitted together?
Yeah.
Well, because of the heating, it was going to grow 3 to 4 inches in length and an inch or 2 in width. And like you said, one of the things you couldn't use rubber bladders because of the heat. The airplane's titanium, so it was kind of loosely put together anyway. My wife was around the airplane before I was, up close. And she came back and said, we were living in Kadena, Okinawa, Japan. And she came back and said, pull your volunteer statements, the most dangerous thing I've ever seen. They're all wearing raincoats. Speed of the airplane. You think that?
flight manual limit was Mach 3.3. Ordinarily, we were not allowed to exceed Mach 3.2. For my one time, for our last flight across the nation, there was some interest in having us go faster than 3.3. So I called Lockheed and asked, I called the Skunk Works and said, for a one-time last flight, can I exceed Mach 3.3 on our speed dash across the country? They did a week-long study, and 4 engineers, Lockheed engineers, came up and met with me and JT personally and said, do not fly faster than 3.3. They said it was never flight tested faster than 3.3. And if you have an unstart faster than 3.3, you may not be able to keep the pointed end forward. It'll pitch up and break apart. So JT and I looked at each other, and I think 3.3 was fast. It's going to be fast. But I think that there are some stories about it going faster.
I've seen 3.49.
Oh.
And he related that they took the airplane a couple times right where Dave's talking about 3.5, but it was so unstable, and just like Ed said, if you'd had an unstart, you weren't going to be able to control the airplane. The airplane was probably just going to disintegrate right here.
So, you lost 12
Her question was, we lost 12 airplanes over the course. There were 32 built, and we did lose 12, mostly in the program. And she asked the question, were they all crashes? Does anybody? Obviously, because we lost them, they were. There were a number in the test program, because this was a first-of-a-kind airplane, the A-12 and the SR-71. So there were things that the test people had to do to see how you could fly it, but they didn't fly it operationally. So when the Air Force received the airplanes, then you had to missionize it. How are we going to fly it in continuous operations through the life of the airplane? And we found some hiccups there. And there were some problems, you know, airplanes like cars or that. But again, getting back to the magnificent rocket ejection seat, so we never lost anybody on that. Yes, sir, right back here.
So out of any of the flight crew here, have any of you had to punch out of this aircraft?
No, there's nobody here that's ever experienced the parachute recovery. We're going to talk about unstarts, restarts. You want to take that, Pat, or want to?
The term unstart refers to the shock wave in the inlet being a control mechanism for it malfunctioning and making it expel the shock wave from the front of the inlet, which creates a violent yaw. But the airplane has built-in systems to counter that. It would automatically get the rudder in the opposite direction to keep it from losing control. And the inlet would then try to recover. Meanwhile, the other engine is slowing down to minimize the yaw problem. And normally, it would just last for a couple of seconds, but it would really get your attention and knock your head off the side of the canopy. That was early on when we had an electric hydraulic control system for the inlets. Later on, they came up with a system called DAFX, which stood for Digital Automatic Flight and Inlet Control System, and that almost completely eliminated the unstart problem.
Afterburner system. Imagine you're at 80,000 feet. The outside pressure is 0.4 pounds per square inch versus 14.7 where you're sitting right now. The outside air temperature is minus 80 degrees as a standard, somewhere in that range. So you're now absorbing air into that inlet that is being compressed in the inlet itself, because that's where you carry the shock. As it's slowed, when it reaches the first stage compressor, it is now in the 17 pounds per square inch. It is actually more pressure for that engine then it would be sitting here. It no longer is minus 80 degrees. It's about 857 degrees because of the compression. So you can kind of see the creativity and the innovation that had to take place. So you can convince that engine that it doesn't know it's at 80,000 feet. It thinks it's at sea level because it's getting a fine source of air, even though the air is very hot to fly.
They were big into what they call hypos, the name of the game. So before we got suited up, we would usually get some steak and eggs and some fruit juice or something, whatever you wanted to drink. You didn't generally, and most of us that were a little smarter, didn't take a lot of coffee because that would create a problem. I was fortunate enough to fly a 10.5-hour mission one time, and my beloved pilot didn't go once during the trip, and I said, "You are crazy." I took a chance. It was the only time I ever used our facilities in flight, and it worked twice nicely. So, for number one, two wasn't a good option. But the whole idea was just kind of watch what you eat before you go fly, and the flights weren't generally that long, so we were able to cope.
Yes, ma'am. The pressure's at 26, but who wants to cover the longer physiological? Anybody? I'll let Dave.
The airplane physically was a very easy airplane to fly. The hardest part of it was the mental aspect of it, trying to keep up with 36 to 38 miles a minute. You have to work really hard brain-wise to be able to stay ahead of it. One of the things that Buzz mentioned that was a problem, or could be, breathing 100% oxygen for that amount of time. It tends to get into your inner ear if you don't valsalva or anything. And so, especially if you flew a night mission, you had to be really careful not to go to bed right away because you could get a real bad earache. About the only other thing as far as the physical aspect of it was just sitting there. That, like Barry said, a 10-hour flight. One of the things that I did was we could use the spacesuit for exercise. You just turn up some pressure in the seat and it would lift you up off the seat, and you could take the pressure out and sit back down again, and it also compressed. It was almost like having a massage. The pressure would give you some blood flow to help out, but otherwise the airplane was really, I thought, very easy to fly, other than the mental aspect of it.
In the blue back there, basically the SR-71 program supplanted the A-12s that had already been operating out of those facilities for about a year.
And did you? So I flew the RF-4. What was your question about the RF-4? Oh, I see. Oh, okay. Yeah, I see. It probably did help. They like for us to have experience in more than one aircraft, and so. But I think some of them were able to get into the SR-71 with just the RF-4. Really love flying the RF-4. We're primarily low altitude, high speed photography, so it's a different mission. But it was a very enjoyable airplane to fly. We thought it would have been something really important. Also, being prepared.
And I'll add to that. The individual, Major Jerry O'Malley, who later became Colonel Jerry O'Malley, Wing Commander, later 4-star General O'Malley. When he went to Southeast Asia, he went in RF-4s. That's where I met him. And so he was very keen on the discipline and the flight characteristics that RF-4 pilots demonstrated. So I think during that time period, leading up to being the Wing Commander, and shortly thereafter, there were a fair number of RF-4 or F-4s, but then it spread out. Like Barry talked about 111s, and we had a B-52 guy. I mean, I think we even had a tanker guy at one point. It was more how you flew the airplane that they were interested, and they did want the air refueling, because this was not the airplane you wanted to teach somebody how to air refuel from. You wanted them to come in with that experience already at hand. Yes, first test flight was on the 22nd of December 1964 with Bob Gilliland. The first operational flight, I think, was like 27 March 1968 with Jerry O'Malley.
I can't remember the exact letters right now, but we had them on both sides, left and right side. The nose was replaceable. You could have a photo nose, you could have a radar nose. We also had equipment on both sides. At one time, we actually had another camera. This small camera behind me was called a trock. That fit in a bay that was forward of the nose wheel well, and that was sort of a defunct camera that we didn't use later on. It was more of a mapping type camera, and so it wasn't beneficial. So normally, the tech camera that you see on the other side, we would fly with a couple techs. You would fly with your DEF system, the DEF over there. We had a DEF A2C you would fly with. We had EMR, which later on became an IP system, which recorded all kind of electronics. So besides photographs, we were also recording any kind of radars, electronic signals, whatever they had. Depending on the weather, OBC nose, 10,500 feet of film, 30-inch optical bar camera. Nighttime, bad weather, we had a radar nose that we could put on the airplane in 68 minutes.
Next question. You start out with a very high number. I think on takeoff roll, was it around 70,000 pounds per engine per hour? But then obviously as you climb up and you accelerate, I think I've seen as low as 15,000 pounds per hour per engine in the latter part of the cruise. You cruise for up to an hour and a half. I mean, it was about 2 hours between refuelings. We had 80,000 pounds of fuel. You did not hook up the refuel empty. You know, that was, you had to be able to go somewhere else if something didn't work. So basically in that 2 hour time period, you probably burned at least 10,000 gallons of fuel. Like there's fuel. Obviously you changed what were the change in the flight characteristics dealing with this airplane at a slow speed? I'll go back to our test pilot.
You know, the airplane had an autopilot, but a lot of times we would turn the autopilot off, or it might be inoperable, and the airplane had really good flight characteristics at that high speed. We'd be cruising along near 2,000 miles an hour, in our speed run case, almost 2,200 miles an hour, and you would think the airplane would be really pitch sensitive. You know, you would think it maybe oscillate real heavily, but the knots equivalent airspeed were low. So a typical knots equivalent airspeed was something like, say, 380 knots equivalent airspeed, and that meant that the airplane would feel like you were flying at near sea level at 380 knots. And so it had really good flight characteristics at supersonic speeds. And so the flight characteristics were about the same throughout the regime of the airplane.
From the Air Force, I became an airline pilot when I was at the flight engineer panel on a 727 for Alaska Airlines. Going from Seattle to Anchorage one day, I was all caught up on my paperwork and everything was working. So just out of curiosity, I started comparing miles per gallon in an SR-71 at Mach 3.2 versus a Boeing 727 at 0.8 Mach. And it turns out that although our fuel burn was 4 times that of the 727, we were going 4 times as fast. So the miles per gallon was just about the same.
That wasn't a problem. Obviously, in bigger airplanes, like I flew a demonstration flight on a B-52, and you did get, and the C-5 the same thing because of the the size of the airplane? Because
There was an interesting problem with the KC-10 though. When we first started off with it, the first, I can't even remember who flew the first one, but they kept getting bumped off of the boom. And I flew the second one, and they discovered that what was happening was that you can see how long the fuselage is on that airplane, and it would really bounce around. The airplane wasn't moving, but the fuselage would flex. The KC-10 had an automatic system, and if they were in auto system, the computer, when the airplane flexed, would say, hey, you're going to exceed a parameter, and it'd throw you off the boom. And so you flat could not fly behind that airplane hooked up and stay if you were in auto. And so after considerable consideration, I guess, the Air Force finally decided that they'd allow us to refuel in manual, and then we never had another problem with it.
As far as I know, I've never been shot at. You know, in the SR, we cruised around the borders of the Soviet Union with a reconnaissance mission, and quite often you'd see the Soviet fighters, you could see their contrails far below. And so it was interesting, every now and then one would try to intercept, and sometimes, well, at one time I saw one zoom to altitude and run completely out of speed and then just drop away. So we felt as long as we were at speed and altitude, we were safe. We felt safe as long as speed and altitude. Of course, you know, there's a lot of things to watch in the cockpit, and you wanted to be sure and catch any malfunction early that you might have. So it was a busy flight. Yeah, that's all we got.
Edie. And again, the tactic was you just turn a little bit, and the end game for the missile was impossible. But I think they did see it detonate off in the distance, but it was no damage done to it. But I was in a similar area. It was a DMZ in Korea, and we were making a turn, leaving to go home after we had done our take, making a left turn for whatever reason. I just happened to be up here, and I saw a weather balloon. And when you're doing 2,000 miles an hour, it's pretty bloody impressive how quick a thing can go out of your sight. Well, the debriefers, when I got on the ground, I tried to explain to them what had happened, and they said, well, how big was it? And I said, well, Jesus, I have no bloody idea if it was within a half mile and big or way out there. But it turned out, we think it came from China, and the kicker was the next day, I think they saw some degree of success in doing that. The next day, when the crew was flying, they picked it up on radar, before they ever got off, they picked it up on radar that there was a swarm of them that they had released all at once. And it was probably a tactic just to try and take down an airplane, because you couldn't avoid it, obviously, but it was quite a sight to see it rip by your face.
Afterwards, but if you ran into something at the speeds we were traveling, there wouldn't be a lot of recovery. One of the things.
Yeah, I was just amazingly blessed to have the opportunity when I had just first got into the program. They dedicated a street to Kelly at Beale Air Force Base, and he and Bill Park came up for that dedication. But they didn't have anything else for them to do. I don't know exactly what the situation was or why they went that way, but my backseater and I were assigned to escort him for the entire day. And so I got the opportunity to be one-on-one with Kelly and Bill Parks for an entire day. It was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. I've never met anybody quite like him. We went to all different kinds of places. The man could talk about any subject, anything that you wanted to talk about. He could talk to an aeronautical engineer, probably to Einstein, and he'd never talk down or up to anybody. To me, he was just an amazing person.
When I entered the program in 1983, he had had some light strokes, and he was only taking visitors from his closest friends. So I never got to actually meet him, but I did get to fly the airplane in front of him one time, and that was at the end of the program, in December of 1989. Lockheed asked the Air Force if we would make 3 passes at Burbank for the Lockheed employees, and I was fortunate to get to make that flight. So for the 3 passes down at Burbank, and several thousand Lockheed employees were lined up along the taxiway, and it was just such an honor to fly in front of the Lockheed employees. They had dedicated so much of their lives to this airplane and other airplanes. And afterwards, I was told by Ben Rich, who had taken over the Skunk Works, that Ben had brought Kelly Johnson out in his wheelchair, and he said that as we departed with the afterburners, he said Kelly Johnson had tears in his eyes as we departed. So it was emotional for him, and Kelly's one of my heroes for sure.
About 3 one-on-ones with Kelly, and then a couple telephone calls, because if you got a message in your box when you came back from a flight that Kelly wanted to talk to you, you needed no permission. You called down to Burbank, you talked to the secretary, she told you the secure frequency, the secure telephone number, and what time to call. But I'm going to back it up. I've just arrived at Beale, I've checked out in the T-38, the wing commander says, set up a flight, you and I are going down to Burbank tomorrow, and I want you to meet Kelly. So we fly down to Burbank, and we go into Kelly's office, and it's very cordial. You know, the wing commander says this is going to be one of our newest SR pilots. He's coming from Japan in the RF-4. And then pretty soon the wing commander says, Kelly, I've got some other stuff to do. So he leaves me there with Kelly. I'm a captain. And so Kelly goes, we talk a little bit, and then he looks at me and says, Captain, who owns the SR-71 aircraft? And I said, well, sir, they belong to the U.S. Air Force. Wrong. They belong to me. Everything on the airplane's recorded. So if you don't follow the checklist exactly as they're published, the next time you and I meet may not be as friendly. Do you understand? That's my initial introduction to Kelly Johnson. But as the 2 ahead of me talked about, he was just he's a giant of the 20th century. He was very engaging, he was open to questions, he was open to changes if you could prove to him why what you were suggesting was a better option than what he had. He was not arbitrary that you had to do it the absolute Kelly Johnson way. He looked to you for ideas. The worst thing you could ever do was come into Kelly's office and say, boss, I don't have a clue on what to do with this, after he'd given you a job. You were probably going to get fired in the next 30 seconds. You go back to your desk. You may or may not be cleaning it out, and he'd come back and you go, what the blank are you doing? I'm still paying you, so get back to work. He had a volatile personality. But I'm happy to say he loved crew members. You know, so we've been delighted to be with you today. But we want to show you a video, a very emotional video for all of us. The Soviet Union. They started with a U-2, and on its early flights, 4th of July, 5th of July, 1956, flying over Leningrad.